the first segment we would like to ask about has to do with education. That's the top goal of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. And Dr. Paul, during the Bush administration, we had No Child Left Behind, and that still continues in its form today. And then under the Obama administration, we have Race to the Top competition, which Kentucky lost out on, at least in these rounds so far. And they've come up with what they call the Blueprint for Education. A variety of states, I think 48 states, are working together to come up with national academic standards for students. And with all of that fundamental work going on in education, I guess my first question would be, what do you see as the federal role for education relative to the state role of education?
Most of the people I've talked to in education aren't big fans of No Child Left Behind. It was passed by Republicans, but I was one of the Republicans who was opposed to No Child Left Behind. Not that I'm opposed to national standards, but I think we should find those national standards. They were out there. Even when I was a kid, we took the California Achievement Test and we compared ourselves to other states. I think we've been reinventing the wheel, knowing something's wrong with education, knowing we're not doing the best education we could. But we've reinvented all these state testing where how do we know if Kentucky state testing compares to Iowa or Indiana or any other state? But we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on Kentucky testing, and yet we're unsure how it compares. Whereas when I was a kid, you took a test and you compared yourself with all the different states because most of them were taking a national test, even way back in the 60s and 70s. So I think national comparisons are good, but I think we've mistaken and we've just thrown money at the problem sometimes. No Child Left Behind created a lot of extra testing. The teachers don't like it, and many old school conservatives don't like it because of the expense. And it's not that I'm opposed to testing, I'm just opposed to giving up more control, more distant away from the problem. The school superintendents that I've talked to, particularly one that's retired and who's actually a patient of mine, tell me that when they look at and they ask who are the best teachers, who are the teachers who get the kids to do the best things, it's usually pretty simple things. Like one superintendent told me, he said, well, it's when one of my best teachers was who every Friday would call all the parents. She had 20 kids in the class or 22 kids in the class. She would call all the parents and say, Susie's doing her homework in math but not doing her homework in English. Johnny's not doing any of his homework, and get the parents involved. I think so often we are looking for someone to blame, and so people say, oh, it's the teachers. We've got bad teachers, or we've got bad principals, or we've got bad schools. But really, it's all of our responsibility. It's that parents aren't doing enough. But this particular teacher that called her parents every Friday and said who's doing their homework and who's not had the highest scores of anybody in the class. That's not something you had to be told to do from Washington. It was people working together and bringing the parents into the equation. And I think that's a lot of the problem. It's not just to be blamed on teachers or on schools. It's also parents not participating enough with their kids.
President Obama has surprised some observers by coming out, he and Arne Duncan, in favor of charter schools in certain circumstances, and he has a bit of a tenuous relationship, I think, with the core constituency of his, the president that is, with the teachers union over how he has taken on some education reform issues. Talk to us about charter schools and how we try new solutions to make progress in education.
I'm in favor of charter schools. I'm also in favor of school choice. I think that the dollars should be left with the individual, with the parents and the individual, such as vouchers, and let them choose where they go to school. I think that would allow for more competition and would allow people to choose which schools they go to and would make the schools better. You know, I've visited a lot of the folks over in the West End in Louisville who are unhappy about their school situation, and it's kind of interesting that the people most unhappy about it are the people in the minority communities who are being bused 2 and 3 hours a day. You know, originally busing was seen as this great thing that was going to make all the schools more equal, but now what it's seen as a penalty to some kids who ride on the bus 2 and 3 hours a day to go to different schools, and the schools haven't gotten better. What the people in the West End who I talk to want is they want neighborhood schools. They want the schools to be just as good as anywhere else in the community, but they want better schools and better environments in their neighborhood, but they don't want to be sent 2 and 3 hours across the city to another school. And we've been doing that for 30 or 40 years, and it isn't working.
As you know, the Kentucky legislature failed to include anything that was charter school friendly in their application or the application Kentucky sent to Washington for Race to the Top. Do you think that played a critical role in our inability to win out in that competition?
I think it did, and I think we have to look for creative new solutions and not be closed-minded as to how we fix the education system, and I think often it is. I mean, John Stossel did a thing on education not too long ago in New York City, and he held up the union contract, and it was like a 30-page union contract. No teacher had been fired in 5 years, and they had 400 teachers in a building who had been inappropriate with students, either touched students or were inappropriate verbally, but were considered to be unsafe to be around kids, but they couldn't fire them. So they had 400 teachers in a building going to school every day collecting a check, but they couldn't get rid of them because the contract was so complicated with the union you could never get rid of somebody, even someone who was inappropriate with a child.
You earlier called for, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the elimination of the Department of Education on the federal level. What's your position on that relative to all that's going on?
Well, we've had the Department of Education since 1979, and some would argue that we haven't been getting better. In some ways, we've been losing ground internationally with education since then. Still, the vast majority of education funding is done by state and local. Most people don't realize this. They think, oh, if you eliminated the Department of Education, we'd have no education. No, we just have less federal control. It was part of the Republican platform, I think, at least from 1980 through 88, but it may have been all the way through 92, part of the platform to eliminate the Department of Education. Somewhere along the way, Republicans, began adopting the idea that we would have more federal control, and under George W. Bush, we doubled the Department of Education with No Child Left Behind. But I think it's a mistake. I would like to see more local control. I would like to see local school boards involved, parents, parent-teacher associations, principals, superintendents. When I talk to school superintendents, I talked to 5 of them recently up from northern Kentucky, and they tell me, one of them told me he had a $150 million budget, but fully a third of that was designated by the federal government what he could do with it. And he had no choice. So we wonder why our schools can't buy pencils and computers and chalkboards and all the basic necessities of teaching kids. It's because the federal government is telling them a third of their budget has to go to these items, and there's no way around it. The school superintendent doesn't have the power to make decisions on funding and where the funding goes, and it might be different one year. You might one year have 4 children who are quadriplegics and require a lot of care, and then the next year you might not have any, but the funding's the same every year because it's coming down from Washington. So you need to allow, I think, more ability of local school leaders to make decisions with where the funding is spent.
Okay. I think we have time for another question or so. Deb or Carolyn, anything on education? I have a couple more questions if you want me to.
Go ahead.
All right, okay. They'll cover a couple of the other areas. There's a lot of talk about being globally competitive, and you see the studies where we rank relative to Indiana and Tennessee, but now we're seeing more information about how we rank relative to Japan, China, Finland, whatever. What is your thought about how Kentucky students can be globally competitive in the future?
Well, I think we're doing some things right. I'm always amazed, and I know more about Western Kentucky University just because that's in the city that I'm from. But we're teaching Mandarin now. We have native speakers teaching Mandarin, and we have an honors program down there. I mean, we're doing a lot of things right. I read the same good things. I've met some of the young McConnell scholars at U of L who are some of our best and brightest that we're trying to keep in the state. These are more state issues than federal. I hear the same good things about UK and Murray and Eastern. I mean, I think we're doing some good things to keep people here education-wise. As far as being globally competitive or bringing company and industry into Kentucky, we're trying to compete with a state to the south of us that has no income tax. So I think you have to look at your tax structure, and you have to look at what will bring industry into your state. We have to look at also what industry we have in our state, and there's a lot of industry that's here because of our low electric rates. So that's why I've been very vocal in saying President Obama's agenda as far as bringing cap and trade on, the rising electric rates that will bring will be a disaster for Kentucky. We have 2 aluminum smelters up near Henderson. They employ 1,600 people, and they depend on cheap electricity. And if electric rates go up or double, as some had said they would under cap and trade, I think we'd lose those jobs, plus all the jobs that depend on those jobs. So it's not just the jobs we'd lose in the coal fields in eastern Kentucky. And in Western Kentucky, we'd lose the jobs of all these industries that have located here because of cheap electricity as well.
Okay. Thank you for your thoughts on education.
Thank you.